Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show inspiring men to be mindful about their lives. Each week, we'll dive into a range of topics that matter to men and hear from everyday people doing extraordinary things. So if you love the show, please give it a 5-star rating and share it with your mates. Now, before we get into this week's episode, please note that some of the content may trigger you. And if this happens, please reach out to your support networks. It's really important. If you can't get enough of Mindful Men, head over to our website. It's www.mindful-men.com.au. Find the show notes and the links to our socials there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rinnie, and today we're getting mindful about disability, the NDIS, so the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and a role called Support Coordination. And I'm really excited about this discussion today because previously we have talked about the role of a psychosocial recovery coach, which is similar but different in the NDIS space. But I'm really keen to unpack the role of a support coordinator. It's probably something that is a little bit more well known about, but also not well known about if you're not familiar or maybe you're new to the NDIS space. And we're going to throw a whole bunch of acronyms at you. It is the nature of something that is derived from the public service or the public sector, but we'll try and define those acronyms as we go. Now, joining me for today's discussion, I have a support coordinator on the line, Hannah Redford from Brisbane. How are you going, Hannah?
Hi, Simon. I'm really good. I'm really excited.
Oh, I'm excited to have you on the show. I was fortunate enough to come on your podcast as well. So you're a podcaster too in What in the NDIS Now podcast, which is a really cool insight into the different types of supports in the NDIS, what it is. So I'm just grateful that you have said, yes, I want to come on the Mindful Men podcast because I work with a lot of men in the NDIS space and the majority of them have a support coordinator. So I'd love to explore what this is, particularly for people who are new to the NDIS. It can be very daunting, overwhelming, etc. But to introduce you to the audience, you're the owner of Tulip Coordination. So that's a boutique independent support coordination company. As I said before, you're the host of the What in the NDIS Now podcast, which talks about all things NDIS. You're a mum of 3. You've got lived experience and learned experience of the NDIS. So welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. That's such an awesome introduction. Sometimes you hear it like that and you go, oh, yeah, right. I do all those things.
I do all those things, everything and above, and more as a support coordinator,
right.
And more as a mum as well. So let's start with, I like to understand how people get into different sectors and industries and mental health and disability as well. So let's start there. So talk us through how you came to be about in the disability sector.
Yeah, so to give you some context about me, I was born in Adelaide. I moved to Melbourne when I was 3, so I don't have too many memories of Adelaide. I've lived in different parts of Victoria until about 6.5 years ago when I moved with my family to Brisbane to be a bit warmer. I always understood about social justice. When I was a baby, my father went to Nicaragua for 6 months during the Civil War to help pick coffee beans. When I was little, and people would sing Baba Black Sheep, I thought the boy down the lane was homeless because it says he lives down the lane. So that made total sense to me because I saw people homeless living in the lanes. I didn't know about English lanes. My parents fostered children throughout my childhood, often several at a time because there's not enough foster families. So often the ones that are there offering to be foster families obviously they would have asked us, but they often go, oh, here's more, we need somewhere else to put these people, which, yeah, kind of sucks for their poor kids. So I understood about disability and mental health also because one of those foster siblings lost a brother to a heroin overdose. So I was quite young when, exposed to all of these things. So I understood them really well. Then my eldest was born with a disability. So my whole life was leading up to being in the industry. My first job in the industry was doing mental health and alcohol and other drugs assessments. When I moved to Brisbane, I was still working in mental health when the National Disability Insurance Scheme rolled out. So it rolled out in stages across Australia. And when it was Brisbane's turn, that's when my manager asked me if I would become a support coordinator. Up until then, I hadn't worked with physical disabilities, just mental health and neurological. Support coordination works with all kinds of disabilities. It's not just physical, it's not just mental or neurological, it's everything. But I love being a support coordinator. So I sort of lucked out in that I was told, hey, become a support coordinator. I was like, oh, what's that? And they were like, we don't know. Okay, I guess I'll figure this out. So I did. It turns out 5.5 years later, I worked it out. I love doing it. And that's part of why I started Tulip Coordination about 2.5 years ago. So now Tulip Coordination has me, and my wife also is a support coordinator alongside with me.
A lot to unpack there. You said a few things that I'm like, oh, I've got to ask about that. I'll ask about that. So you were born in Adelaide. So I'm from Adelaide as well. Do you call yourself, even though you were only there for a couple of years, a South Australian or Victorian?
Oh, look, it depends on the context of the question. Look, most of the time I'm South Australian, mostly because it explains my accent. A lot of people are like, you talk funny. And I'm like, no, it's a South Australian accent because I had that at home. So, yeah.
I asked that because for anyone who's listening, I was like, why are you even asking this question? Like, growing up in Adelaide, like I grew up watching footy, AFL footy, and there's a big rivalry between South Australia and Victoria in the football, but it also extends into politics, into culture. There's been a few sprays between the different premiers over the years as well. So I guess it's similar to the Queensland-New South Wales rivalry that we have on the East Coast. We have that same down on the South Coast. So, okay, that's that question done and dusted. You're a proud South Australian, crow eater.
Yep.
Interested also because you talked about growing up in a foster care family. Well, your parents were foster care parents.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of my early days in the NDIS. So when I was a planner, so everyone who knows my story, and you know my story as well, was a planner for rollout here on the Sunshine Coast, Gympie, Moreton Bay region. And I specialised in child safety planning. And often, I'd be talking to foster carers or families that are looking after multiple kids. Like we're talking 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a lot of kids. And over the years, that's like a revolving door as well. So it creates a lot of community for kids. And as you said, it's a bit sucky for the kids, but it creates a bit of community, a bit of stability, but it also creates chaos as well in those households. Would you define your household as a chaotic household growing up?
Absolutely, because my parents had 4 kids for starters, and then we had ring-ins, these foster kids. We didn't need extras. There was already 4 of us.
As you said, it opens up your eyes to a whole bunch of things as well.
Absolutely.
I guess that as we grow and develop, as kids, we don't really know what's going on. But when we become adults, we can reflect back and go, okay, this is the way I am. This is why I'm passionate about either mental health or disability and so forth. And you touched on another element as well as your daughter being born with disability. Can you talk us a bit about that lived experience as well, what it was like being a mum with a child with disability?
Yeah, so she has autism and an intellectual disability. What they found was, so there's ventricles in your brain that supply the fluid to your spinal cord and then back around your brain. Those ventricles in her brain are oversized, and it means it squashes the bits of the brain that surround those immediate ventricles. So yes, what I describe it as is, I call it extreme parenting, a bit like extreme sports. You know how they have those people who jump out of helicopters on skis and then sort of like go skiing down the mountain out of a helicopter? That's what parenting a child with a disability is like, because there's just no way of knowing what's next. And you sort of just have to strap yourself in and go with it and try your best and go to 1 million appointments. And it's very hard to hold down a normal job, which is part of why I decided to run my own company because I felt bad being employed by these people and then constantly having to, sorry, I've got this appointment and that appointment. And so, yeah. I mean, it's just my life. It's what I've known of parenting. So now I have 3 children in total. 2 of them are on NDIS. My poor middle child is brilliant and is so protective of their siblings, but definitely has been affected by having siblings with disabilities and has some mental health issues at 14, which is not really what you try to go for. So, yeah.
But I guess knowing your history and your story as well, you're really well placed to support your middle child or all your children, but also yourself and your wife as well, to navigate that and to tune into their mental health. How did that impact your mental health as well? Like, because you said like it's like jumping out of a helicopter onto a ski slope. For a parent, that could be pretty daunting in itself. Like, talk us through your mental health journey as well.
Yeah. Well, when my eldest was born, I had pretty severe postnatal depression and I spent 5 weeks in the mother-baby unit. So that is a mental health ward that is specifically where mothers can have their babies with them. Typically, in the first few weeks of life, you're breastfeeding, so they try to keep you with your baby. A lot of the women and people there were not. We bottle feeding. But anyway, so I was there for 5 weeks. And I think if you know something about mental health wards, you know that's a pretty long time. Then through the years, look, I think what's been really important for me is medication, the old SSRIs. If you don't produce naturally the serotonin you need, store-bought is just fine. And if people want to talk down to you because you have to take medication, tell them to go jump. Because, yeah, look, really the difference between me and a lot of the people I support is that I'm able to function on medication. Like, I do have to change medications every few years. I found that just being on the same one doesn't have the same effect after sort of 3-4 years. So I do have to swap. So I've been on lots of different ones, as a lot of people find they do. But yeah, I find for me it's really the only way I can function and do my job and be okay enough to work with, to support my kids well enough and my wife. And even then, there are days when depression still, I've been taking my medication just fine and depression will still smack me over the head. But on those times, I communicate with my wife and say, hey, I can feel it. It's just smacked me over the head. I'm going to take today off or whatever. And we just try and work together on that because so my wife is diagnosed autistic and ADHD. She also has borderline personality disorder and dissociative identity disorder. So I actually don't deal with just her. I deal with about 10 of her parts to her system, which is also an interesting ride. And that can be difficult because sometimes I know I've told her something, but then she hasn't been co-conscious and the next part comes out and is like, no, you never told me that. And I'm like, oh, I told the other. Yeah.
It's an interesting point that you're making there, because when we think of disability, or the general consensus is it's something that's visible, it's something that's physical, right? But what we've come to learn is that there's this concept called psychosocial disability, there's neurological disability, there's intellectual disability, there's a whole bunch of disability that is unseen.
Yeah.
And so you're living that in your household, which I think, and this ties into that medication story as well, because a lot of the people that we work with in this industry, and myself included, as a therapist, I'm on medication as well. I need my meds to function. A lot of the people that we work with are on a smorgasbord of medications, and having some idea of what it feels like to be on medications or to change medications I remember changing medications and all the the withdrawals and those symptoms, what that feels like. So that's scary in itself. There's actually a bit in the media at the moment around brain zaps. And I'm like, yes, I've had this. It's so nice that other people are talking about this because I'm saying this, but people are just looking at me going, what are you talking about? It's like electric shocks in my brain when I come off medication. It's an interesting dynamic, but this lived experience leads into you being a very well-rounded support coordinator who can walk in most, I won't say any, but most households, mental health wards, hospitals, school environments, whatever environment that our NDIS participants, and now I'm going to say participants here because for anyone listening, the NDIS, the clients of the system, which we would normally understand people as clients or customers, we call them participant because they're participating in the scheme. So to be able to walk into any NDIS participant's environment with this lived experience understanding, with the medication understanding, that's a huge advantage for you. A, to understand or have empathy into their story, but B, give them some insights into, okay, well, this is how we navigate life in all of its quirkiness, you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'll throw in there, since we're talking about it, and then we can move on to support coordination, is that after 11 years of being married to my wife, that's when she came out to me as transgender. And so that's also how we have kids. We did it the way everyone else does, by the by. And how we got married before same-sex marriage came in, because people often ask me that question too. But also, like, you don't have to ask people personal questions. You can just wonder that by yourself. So suddenly changing gears about 5 years ago was, okay, right. That's not what I ever expected life to throw at me when I pictured life when I was young. Okay. So then it was like, all right, what do we have to do? What do we do next? And as I've gone further on that bit of the journey, what I've discovered is that there's so many people whose cis wife leaves them after coming out. And I really think that's really sad because, you know, now my wife is able to be who she truly is. And actually she's happier and a better person because she's not trying to pretend to be male anymore. So actually our relationship has just gotten better and better. And, you know, now we're more in love than ever before. So I think it's something that's really important to me. So it's more lived experience. So I do as Tulip Coordination. I also work with the LGBTIQ plus community and in particular transgender participants because although I am cis, I do understand a lot more about it than most support coordinators. And I know some of the surrounding issues like partners leaving, families abandoning you, lots of those sorts of things. Anyway, so yeah, just thought I'd add that there.
No, thanks for adding because it provides context. It's really important to understand. I'm a social worker and context is important. So we'll park that because that might be another episode in itself. But let's get into support coordination and how this all ties in together. So can you talk to us in the best way you can, because it can be a bit complex. What is a support coordinator in the NDIS?
Man, sometimes I wish I knew. I tend to ask this question on my podcast too, because I'd really love someone to tell me. So I'll give this caveat when I get started. One of the problems is that the NDIS itself has never fully defined what they want support coordinators to do or be. What the role is. So that has meant that every support coordinator does do it slightly differently. So I'm really sorry to those of you out there who have a crap support coordinator. I hear the stories all the time. I can assure you there are good support coordinators out there. I have loads of colleagues that are amazing, wonderful people. But I'm going to try to give you a bit of an overview of, like, at a minimum standard, what these people should be doing. So the first thing you need to know is that not everyone who is on the NDIS gets a support coordinator. It's really only those who have a few more complexities and potentially will have difficulty understanding and navigating the NDIS who get support coordination. It is a stated item, which means it needs to be written into the plan. So if it's not written in your plan, you don't have it. There are 3 levels of support coordination. Level 1 is support connection, which is we don't really see. Originally, LACs were supposed to take on that task, and then that never eventuated, but theoretically that's there. Then there is level 2, support coordination, which is what I do, which is also the most common. And I'll discuss this further in a sec after I explain level 3. Is called specialist support coordination, and that's for people who are more complex again and have other things going on, which I will get to. So the role of a support coordinator is not for the faint-hearted. The second thing you need to know is that a support coordinator comes under the banner of capacity building, and a support coordinator should be capacity building a participant. So like you, I will use the word participant. I don't love the word participant, but it's the word we've got. It's the word the NDIS uses. So it's the easiest to just continue using that word.
What would you use alternatively?
Oh, look, this has been discussed frequently on my podcast, and I don't have another good word. So I had a really great guy, Daniel Henshaw, on my podcast, and he suggested I just call them my peeps. And I was like, no, because also they're not mine. I don't own these people. So anyway, but we'll go with participants for lack of a better word. Now, to capacity build someone looks different for everyone because not everyone has the full cognition to be able to understand all of it. So, however, what I do is no matter what, I go in and I explain to the participant every aspect of their plan, including who is who and who does what under their plan. Even if they don't remember, often this gives them the vibe about how the NDIS starts to fit together. So I scribble all over their plan explaining this bit does this bit and this bit does this bit.
Before I go any further, can you explain what a plan is?
Oh, God. Okay. So under the NDIS, the idea is that the funding sits with the individual. Previously, when we had block funding, the funding sat with an organisation. And what this meant was that it was if you hated the company that you were put with, it was very hard to then change and move somewhere else. So often people just put up with subpar support. So the idea of the NDIS was that the funding sits with an individual. So each individual needs to show how their disability affects them. Then they get funding for that individual. Your plan shows you it's not a plan as like a roadmap. It's the name for giving you an amount of funding that you can then spend on supports. So that money you never physically get. What it does is it sits in the cloud, and then the cloud pays your supports. Now, it gets more complicated than that because it is actually broken down into now 4 major categories. This I call the major headlines, and then you've got sub-headlines. So you have core, capacity building, capital, and reoccurring. So under core is your support workers, is cleaning, meal preparation. It is if you need support with lawn mowing, if you need support like respite, although we do call that short-term accommodation under the NDIS. So it's not respite, but it's short-term accommodation.
Yeah.
All comes under core. Okay. Then you've got capacity building. Under capacity building, you have plan managers, which I can explain in a minute. Then there is allied health professionals.
Mm-hmm. That's where I fit in, yes.
Yes. And then you can also have things like support to keep a job, which it's not called that, but something close to that. It's just gone out of my mind. There's improved relationships, which is positive behavior support. And then there's also support coordination, is its own little category under the big headline of capacity building. Then comes capital. Under capital is typically your big 8 assistive technology items, such as a wheelchair, a bed, a recliner, all of those sorts of things. Often that is also where you find the money for repairing those items. So that's where to look for if you've funded to repair those and service those items. Okay, the fourth one is called reoccurring, and that is for transport, which you only have now if you are in the PACE system, which is the new system that we're transitioning towards. That is killing most people. Not literally, it's just making all of our brains explode trying to navigate it. And if we struggle to navigate it, all bets are off for participants to try and navigate it. So yeah, that's the plan.
You've touched on a few things, that it is quite a complex system. It's complex to even describe. And I always say that the NDIS was built to be an accessible system for people with disability who need to have different accessibility needs, but it's at the same time, it's also very inaccessible. It's very difficult to understand. And that's where I guess the beauty of a support coordinator can come in, because you can unpack that with the different participants and their families and supports. And you also highlighted before as well, like it's when someone comes onto the NDIS scheme, they've got to prove disability. They've got to prove that they have a disability. And then I guess an important note here is that we've talked about all the different categories and different types of supports, but those supports are specific to your particular disability as well. So you might not have support coordination if you're on the scheme. You might not get a wheelchair if you don't need a wheelchair. Like these are things like it's always tailored to your specific needs as well. So I think you've just highlighted how difficult it is to actually explain it. It is a very complicated thing. And the thing about the NDIS is constantly evolving. So PACE, when I was in the NDIS, PACE was just getting started, but before that, it was a different system. And so it's constantly evolving. They're changing things all the time. I think the idea is that they're changing things to improve it all the time. Whether or not that is an improvement, I'm not so sure. But at the end of the day, I think it's nice to have individual funding as opposed to block funding, as you said, where the funding used to go to an organisation. Individual funding enables this thing called choice and control. So can you describe for us, that's a bit of a buzzword, choice and control. What does that mean for someone who is working in the scheme, but also someone whose children are on the scheme, but also someone who works with participants of the scheme as well?
Okay. Choice and control is actually my favourite thing about the scheme, because often at the end of my spiel to a participant, and it is much easier to describe when you're in person and you're looking at the plan and you can write all over it. Trying to explain it on an audio medium is gnarly. Often what people get at the end of that is they go, when I see them next time, they go, "Oh, you taught me that I have choice and control." And if that's all they got out of it, that's the best feeling for me. So what is it? It means that you have the choice of who provides the support to you. So you can say that you prefer a female, a male, non-binary, gender fluid, whoever you prefer. There's a caveat to that. The more specific you get, the harder that person is to find. So think about that.
No, I think it's very relative because as a therapist in this game, like I talk to guys and my niche is guys, and it comes up a lot. Like it's the intersectionality of what we do. It's the disability space, but it interplays with culture, religion, spirituality, sexuality as well. I work with guys who goes, I don't want a gay guy that I work with as my support worker. I work with guys who from different populations. So it's African, Indian, even Australian. People that they go, he speaks with a Scottish accent, even from an Anglo background. It's not so much the where they're from, it's the access, the ability to communicate. And that's a big thing in the NDIS is how do we communicate with people in a way that is plain English? Is maybe you're talking to someone with an intellectual disability, so they're not connecting the dots. Maybe the words that we use have different meanings in different contexts as well. And so it's very much of an intersectionality of the disability space, which in itself is quite diverse and challenging, but also beautiful at the same time as well. So you have hit a very important, I think, aspect and one that is very, I wouldn't say unique to the industry, but is very prevalent in the industry when we're working in this space. And I guess as practitioners, we're mindful of all that as well. We're going, okay, well, how can we make this work? What can we do? Have you niched down into your ideal support worker too far? We need to step it back and go, okay, what can we work with? So it's a very valid point.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So choices and control is also about how they provide that support. So do you want them to shower you, or maybe you would just prefer them to stand outside of the shower and be there if you fall, for example, or something like that? So it's also about how they provide support. Now, that can be complex for some participants because that's a decision too far. So that's when an experienced support coordinator can come in and go, okay, often we get an OT in, occupational therapist, who can then do an assessment about a participant's needs, support needs. And then we go, okay, we think we need support based on these areas. Let's put that in place. And then we try that. And then if that doesn't suit you, you go, hey, that's not suiting me. And there's your choice and control again. Now, the other place where choice comes in is as a support coordinator, I will sit down with you, I will get to know you, and then hopefully together we will come up with a plan of saying, well, you need occupational therapy, you need physiotherapy, you need speech therapy, these sorts of people, plus a support worker. And then I'll come back to you after getting to know you and know you like the Broncos or AFL or trains, and I will find you a support worker who also likes those things, or an occupational therapist who also can talk about those things. Because what is really important to me is that you have something foundational to talk about, because there's nothing worse than having someone who's supposed to be there to support you and then you sit there twiddling your thumbs not knowing what to talk about. Whereas if you can both start with, I love the Broncos, which is not me, I know the Broncos exist. That's as good as I've got. And I know the Dolphins exist in the same league. There you go.
I love that point because connection is really important. Quality connection, the ability to go into any environment and build a connection very quickly, because often these supports are, they're time critical as well. An NDIS plan doesn't last forever. Like it has an end date and so forth. The funding doesn't last forever. And so to be able to build connection and build trust and build respect at the same time is crucial. So talking about the footy or talking about trains or talking about video games, I'm having a lot of conversations about video gaming, coffee, surfing, you name it. It just helps build that trust. And I've been there as a client of the mental health system myself. I've been in situations where I've spoken to a therapist and there is no connection. and you're going, what am I doing here? I'm not getting anything out of this. Waste of time. My wife dragging me into this. What's going on? Like, there's all these things we're playing. But when you find someone who you connect with, it enlivens you. It enables conversation. It enables growth and capacity building as well. But also coming back to that choice control component as well, you have the choice to keep doing that service if the funding allows, but also the choice to recognize when it's time to move on. And I've had clients in my therapy service that they've come to a point where like, you know what, Simon, we've reached our goal and it's goodbye. And, I don't like to say goodbye. I'm a bit of a socialite in that sense. But as a therapist, it's a beautiful thing to watch that, to see that happen and for them to go do their thing. Who knows? They might come back and we do it all again. But it is part of the process as well. It's a capacity building process.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am often found at networking events or at expos because I want to find out who else is out there. I don't want to refer to the same people I've used before because that might not be suitable for you. They might not have the thing in common that you do. So I'm always trying to find new people to connect with. So I think that's really unique about me as a support coordinator personally, because I do find that a lot of support coordinators in the area just goes, oh, these are the two I know and the two I always use. You can choose between these two. Whereas I will come back to you and go, these 3 or 4 choices of support workers or OTs are people I have met, maybe not always know really well, but I've met them. I think they would really suit you from what I know of you. And if you're overwhelmed with choice of 3 or 4, you could close your eyes and do eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and you'd still land on someone good. So that also takes away the complication with having to make decisions when you feel overwhelmed with decision making.
So you've touched on a few things. So a support coordinator is someone to help understand this craziness of the NDIS, what it all means to work through an NDIS plan. Like this is what the funding says and this is how we can do it. Connecting in and finding the right supports for you. Or maybe you might not be the right support, but it's what we learn on that process as well. I want to touch on review. So it's also someone who can help review an NDIS plan. So we talked about plans have an end date, which then prompts a review, or maybe you also get a plan that you're not happy with, that you want to do an early review. Can you talk us through the review process and how a support coordinator can help?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to touch on one more thing before I talk about the review, because to me, the review is like the end part of explaining this. So one thing I do is, so you've got all this funding in all these different categories, but how do you spend it? What do you do then? So a good support coordinator will sit there and budget it out with you and go, okay, this means you've got 5 hours a week of a support worker. How would you like to do that? Would you like to do 5 hours all in one go? Would you like to do it over 2 sessions? How do you want to do that? And so the same with all the other categories. How many sessions can you spend with an OT or a physio or your speechy? So sometimes, say, for example, in your allied health budget, you've got $9,000. We go, okay, you can give $3,000 to the OT, $3,000 to the physio, and you've got $3,000 for the speech therapist. So that's how it breaks up. So originally you'll look at it and go, oh, wow, that seems like a lot of money. But then when you budget it down, it's generally really not. So that's when we get to a review. Sometimes that's when you figure out, okay, we've got to go to early review because actually you don't have enough funding. What a support coordinator will do is then we try to gather reports from everyone who is supporting you at the moment. Now, all providers, no matter what they think, need to write a report to justify why they are in your life, because they need to justify to the NDIS why the NDIS is spending money on that support. Now, I've had a lot of support workers say they've never had to do a report before. Why do they have to do one now? Why is it just me asking for this? And I'm like, well, every other support coordinator should be asking you for this too, because you need to justify your existence. It's not just for the OT or just for the physio to justify why you need supports. Everyone needs to come together. So I will contact all of the people who are supporting you, and I will say, hey, in 3 weeks, in 4 weeks, whenever, I need your report in. You send it to me. I then look over them very carefully, and I will send them back if they're not good enough and say, change this word, change that word, change this sentence, take this bit out. My biggest bugbear is anyone who puts BMI in the reports. A participant's BMI is nobody cares. And it's the most useless piece of information you could ever put in a report, because beyond your doctor, nobody cares. And even your doctor these days, they've said BMI is a kind of a useless measure.
Is that the body mass index? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Okay, I'm just making sure that we're on the same BMI pathway.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. There's a lot of acronyms in the NDIS.
There is, body mass index.
Okay.
Particularly when I've had participants with anorexia. And I'm like, can you think for 5 seconds why their body mass index might be a terrible idea to put in your report? Please. So then I write my report where I summarize everyone else's reports in together, and then I highlight in dot points, we're asking for this many hours of support, we're asking for this many hours of OT, we're asking for this many hours of physio, we're asking for this many hours of support coordination, and by the way, we want it all plan managed.
It's an important thing that you're highlighting there is around, because it's essentially public money. So we pay our taxes here in Australia, and the taxes a portion of that goes to the NDIS, which is how it's funded essentially. And so this is the justification. What you're talking about is the justification of spending public money. And that's private. That's people who are independent contractors. That's people who are big businesses in the disability space, and they're support workers, they're allied health professionals, they're support coordinators. It's essentially, how do we justify using public money to support this person with disability? And it's a really valid point that you're raising there. And I like how you talked about the BMI stuff, because it's also something that is individualized to the person. It's about them and supporting them. So great for calling that out and highlighting that. I used to see a lot of reports in my NDIS days that would be copy and paste from one participant to the next, and it's not individualized. The scheme is meant to be an individualized scheme as well. Lots to unpack. There's so much involved in support coordination. I was just wondering, before I let you go, we'll wrap it up soon, but why do you love support coordination so much? Has there been a triumph moment, without mentioning anybody's names or anything like that, that's really stood out to you and go, this is why I do what I do?
Well, over 5.5 years, to be honest, there's been hundreds, which I'm really lucky for. You know, getting wheelchairs approved, for example, and in particular one where the planner really didn't want to approve it because it was the one we were asking for was had a few more bells and whistles than the tier below it. And usually they go for the bottom tier one. And so I had to write a few more justifications, and the OT had to write a few more justifications, and it was a lot of backwards and forwards. And when we got it approved, I was so excited, because it really was the most appropriate for that participant, and the lower tier just wouldn't have been useful. So bathroom modifications, when people have been able to go, oh, I understand this a bit better now. The way you've explained it is, now I get this or that. That's awesome. It's awesome when my participants say, oh, you know, that support worker you found for me, or that psychologist you found for me, they're awesome. They're the best I've ever had before. And I'm just like, yeah, those times are just the best. And when we do go for review and we get the funding that we're looking for, that's also seriously exciting, because a lot of the time, unfortunately, it is a bit of a shit fight. And the times when I dislike my job are never because of my participants. It's always the hitting my head against the brick wall of the NDIA makes it sometimes a little bit miserable. And if you get that too many times in a row, you're like, remind me again why I do this.
And for anyone who's listening, like, the NDIA is the agency essentially who's responsible for the disability insurance scheme, which is where I used to work before I did Mindful Men, and I was a planner, and I was on the other side doing the plans and putting the funding together. But also I used to love those phone calls where I could say, we approved that. It was such a cool thing as a planner to do. Yes, I had a lot of those conversations, so we were unable to approve that, but I was a bit of a softie as well, so things got approved more than they got disapproved. But before we go, I just wanted to do a quick plug for your podcast. So I love having podcasters on, and I've been fortunate to come on and do an interview with you on your podcast. So talk us through what in the NDIS now, like, what's it about? Why did it come about? What's some of the topics that you explore?
So as you can see, I love talking about the NDIS and disability. I can talk about it all the live long day. Also, I love podcasts. I'm obsessed with podcasts. I love them. So I was always like, one day I want to do a podcast because I love podcasts. They're awesome. And so I had accidentally trapped someone one day at the cafe for about 4 hours because they asked me, how does the NDIS work? And I went, well, let me tell you. And then I went, I think I need to make this a podcast. Just stick a microphone in front of my face. I think that would be better than trapping people. So I co-host it with my friend Sam, who is also part of the LGBTIQ plus community. So Sam does compliance and risk and helping providers through the business side of things that I have no interest or understanding of, the boring bits. And I'm the fun one. So he can talk to that sort of stuff. So we interview mostly providers. Hopefully we will also have a few participants coming up who are doing something different in the NDIS space to show other providers that you don't have to do the same boring support that you've done for 100 years. The NDIS is different. You're supposed to do support differently. Do it differently. Don't just constantly take people bowling.
Yes.
Or for a picnic. Like, we've done it. It's fine. Move along. So yeah, we talk to providers who are doing something a bit different, and also talk through any updates, anything's changing, but always talking to people who are on the ground, who do the work. Because I heard other NDIS podcasts and they were, talking to CEOs or talking, and I was like, this person doesn't know what it's really like. And seeing as, me and Sam are at the coalface as well, we wanted to talk to others who are, working with participants as well. And so that's mainly what and it's awesome. And so many of those providers, we have really great conversations about their journeys into the disability sector and about their journeys into what they're doing now and how they feel about that. So yeah, it's awesome.
Podcasting is great for participants as well. So whenever I'm onboarding a new participant and they're not sure, you always get the referral says they're not sure about therapy. I say, okay, before we even, first of all, I'll just have a chat with them on the phone or go meet with them. The second thing is check out, if you're on social media, check out my socials, check out the podcast. You can see what I look like. You can hear what I talk about. You can hear my voice, kind of get a gauge. Is this someone that I might be able to talk to and engage with? And the same with your podcast. You have such a diverse range of providers on there so that participants can go, oh, am I going to talk to Hannah about support coordination? I want to get a bit of a feel for her first. Oh, I can check out her podcast. I don't have to talk to her and be uncomfortable and socially awkward or socially anxious or whatever it is. I can just put her on my computer or on my phone and hear her story.
Yeah, but also you can hear that there are other ways of, as a participant, you can hear that there are other ways of doing support. You don't have to put up with the same old support you've always had, and you'll be able to hear from other providers and potentially go, oh, I really like the sound of that. I might actually go and investigate them further, which is what I sort of hope you do. And then understand a bit wider about how big the scope of NDIS support really is.
Absolutely. I love that. And it's, again, choice and control.
Yeah.
I'll put in the link to the podcast in the show notes. So if anyone's listening and they want to check that out, they should check it out. It is a great podcast and I love it. And also I'll put in the link to Tulip Coordination as well. So if anyone wants to reach out and engage you for support coordination or talk more about support coordination, I'll do that. The last thing I'll ask you is to plug something that makes you feel good. So I ask every guest that comes on to talk about something that is lighting them up at the moment. And the reason for this is that we sometimes do talk about some difficult things that are complex or they're traumatizing in some cases. So it's to leave the audience on a bit of a lighter note. So something you're watching on TV or listening to, a podcast, a self-care activity, an affirmation. What's lighting you up at the moment, Hannah?
Definitely podcasts, always podcasts. So my favorite all-time podcast is called The Dollop. It's hosted by two comedians where they talk about an event from American history in a really funny way, because a lot of history from America is people doing stupid shit and making poor decisions. Now, I will say as a caveat for everyone listening that they do swear quite a bit and they do have sometimes a bit of blue humor, some of that sort of sexualized things. So just don't necessarily take my word for it. It's just something I enjoy that is got nothing to do with what I do, which is something that I really enjoy about it, and I can just laugh.
Laughter is a great way to feel well and be well and heal as well. So thanks for the recommendation, the plug of the Dollop podcast. That sounds really wonderful. But Hannah, thanks so much for coming on, sharing a bit of insight into you as a person, but also you as a support coordinator, you as a wife, a mum, all those things. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really have loved it. And I love your podcast. Mindful Men podcast is great, and I have been telling people about it.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks. Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.